Okay, so we're very much going to look now at Stave 4 and this concept of death, but before we talk about that, let's just think about how it's introduced prior to Stave 4. So we talked in one of the earlier videos about the fact that it starts with Marley, and that's how it begins, with death. Through the quote, Marley was dead to begin with, thus foreshadowing the potential death of Scrooge if he continues going down the path. So the 1843 audience would have been very much aware of the ghost story conventions, and it suggests that death is not something to be feared as it's an everyday occurrence and everyone lives and then dies. By setting the novella up through the theme of death, it appears that Dickens is commenting on the fleeting nature of life and perhaps the idea that you need to be a good person in life, and that is more important than wealth or possessions. So if you want to go to heaven and not end up in purgatory like Marley, you need to be a decent person, not a good man of business. It is also clear that Scrooge feels no fear of death or remorse at the start. He talks about how his partner has been dead for 7 years and that he chooses not to care if he is called Scrooge or Marley, it is all the same to him, showing that he doesn't even attempt to rename the business out of respect for the dead. So this rejection of behaviour that is ethical shows a lack of fear towards the dead and a lack of superstitious response on his part. As well as this, when Marley appears in the door knocker, Scrooge immediately rejects the idea that he can be there, rejecting the common notion of the time that spirits can come and haunt you. Furthermore, the fact that he immediately went to sleep perhaps creates this impression that this first supernatural experience for Scrooge was not wholly upsetting. Dickens' use of purgatory is interesting, as we know that this is a waiting place between heaven and hell, and we all know the symbolic reference is that Scrooge needs to change his ways. However, the dramatic irony is evident here that Scrooge is completely unaware, and his fear of death is not at this point particularly strong, which is strongly contrasted by the time we get to the end of Stave 4. So this means that the other ghosts have to work hard to show Scrooge that he should fear death, or he too will be metaphorically wearing the chains he forged in life, like Marley, and as a punishment for his wrongdoing, avarice and unkindness. So moving to Stave 4, it's an ever-present theme, this idea of death, and Dickens shows the negative impact Scrooge's life choices have on him in death. Scrooge is shown by the ghost of the future, who is symbolic of the Grim Reaper, other people's reactions to his death, ranging from they couldn't care to deep relief, and his own body shrouded on the bed, the reaction of people who were employed by Scrooge, and finally his own tombstone. All of these events were shown to Scrooge using dramatic irony, as Scrooge was unaware throughout the stave that the death he was witnessing was his own. The ghost of Christmas Yet to Come appears shrouded in the black cloak, with only his hand visible, pointing in the direction that Scrooge needs to take. The figure is described as a phantom, which is different to the other ghosts, and it conjures this imagery of death, destruction, and the supernatural nature of the being. The lack of speech from the ghost is also very sinister and creepy, and seems to be a deliberate ploy by Dickens to show how little regard the ghost has for what Scrooge wants to say. By refusing to answer him, remember in Stave 2, it's very much Scrooge asking all the questions. The ghost holds all the power, and Scrooge is powerless in the face of the symbolic figure of death. Perhaps Dickens was commenting on how large the burden wealthy people of Victorian England had on their souls. The capitalist society, due to the Industrial Revolution, caused untold unnecessary deaths, and Dickens could be using the figure of the ghost, like the Grim Reaper figure, show that how you live in life will feature in how you live in the afterlife. The scary, silent and oppressive figure would have piqued the interest of the audience at the time, as they would have understood that this meant time was running out for the main protagonist of Scrooge. The ghost of Yet to Come as a Grim Reaper figure is the ultimate portrayal of death, and one that Scrooge states, "I fear you most, and I'm prepared to bear your company," with the first person pronoun suggesting that Scrooge is ready to take responsibility for his past and listen carefully to the lessons that the future will bring. Ironically, Scrooge is ready to listen, but the ghost is mute with a pointing finger, reinforcing the idea that Scrooge is correct to be fearful of death, as death will be silent, painful, and take him to places he doesn't wish to visit. The verb recoiled in terror shows that Scrooge is no longer marginally fearful of death, but in fact terrified. He sees the shroud and takes a step back, showing his inability to process what he is seeing. connotations of terror or abject fear, distress and horror, and this is the first time we have seen such strong emotions from Scrooge. While Scrooge shows his fear of death properly for the first time, Dickens reinforces this in the Gothic description of the animals trying to get into the room of death. A cat was tearing and gnawing rats. Use of these verbs to describe how the animals try to get in is creepy and terrifying. Furthermore, Scrooge did not dare to think implies he doesn't want to confront the harsh reality linked to death, decaying bodies, being left to be picked at by animals, and exploring how death is so powerful he dare not even imagine it is happening to him or his body. At this point, the dramatic irony increases the tension, as we know Scrooge has been rendered powerless by death, and he isn't even aware of it, that it's his own death. Or you could argue that subliminally he does, and he just isn't ready through his fear to admit it. When Scrooge reflects, "I have not the power," to the ghost, he is admitting his shortfall, and the repetition of this dialogue shows he is finally ready to see the error of his ways, and shows that he has recognised that death is unpleasant, unnecessary for him, and that he is fearful of it, as he is not ready to give up on life. In fact, he isn't ready to change, and this is evident in the way he wholeheartedly uses the mantra, "I will live in the past, the present and the future," at the end of Stave 4, and then repeats at the beginning of Stave 5, to show that he has recognised that he fears death, wants to live, and will be a better man directly as a result of the intervention of the ghosts. So how do the other people in the novella react to the death? So as well as the ghostly figure, we have the portly gentleman from Stave 1 who are discussing Scrooge's death. Old Scratch got his last, and I don't mind going if lunch is provided. When discussing the death of Scrooge and his attendance at his funeral, it is clear at this point that death is gossip and not worthy of human kindness, pity or consideration. All of the men who talk about death do so as if Scrooge was an acquaintance and universally disliked, which was true. Deep relief is later shown by an ordinary family who were indebted to Scrooge due to the fact that they were so poor. They discussed that it would be bad fortune to find such a merciless creditor, suggesting that Scrooge really was the worst of the worst, and that no matter what misfortune came upon them in the future, it could never be as bad as being in debt to the miserly, unkind and uncharitable Scrooge. Death here is presented as a relief to some of the poorest families, while the businessmen seem unconcerned about Scrooge's death. Scrooge is completely oblivious at this point they are talking about him, but he does show some concern and wants to see someone who was happy about the death of the person being spoken about. When shown the couple rejoicing, even that is no comfort for Scrooge, as they rejoice for reasons of relief, not sadness at the death of Scrooge. Dickens continues to show the death as a lonely event for Scrooge when he has shown the body lying in bed with the sheets over it. Dickens may have wanted to show that we need to care and comfort those close to us and not push them away. No one is mourning for him, and this causes Scrooge pause for thought and shows that he can see that this is inhumane and unkind. In death as in life, Scrooge is solitary as an oyster, which shows how little human warmth he is emitted in life. The use of listing and the triplets unwatched, unwept, uncared for was the body of a man, implied that the human in the bed has no one to care for him or mourn for him, which is true at this point in the novella. Scrooge's death shows that he has reaped what he sowed in death, and he is alone like in life. Prior to the deathly figure in the bed, Scrooge was taken to the most inhumane and criminal of places, where the pawnbroker Old Joe lived and took stolen goods and gave a few coins to the most unfortunate people. Dickens uses Gothic conventions to show how miserable and grim the living conditions were in those areas, and this could have been an indication of the experiences that Dickens gained due to his insomniac nightly walks. He was said to have walked the streets of London at night, gaining an insight into the most horrific situations that men and women endured due to the overcrowding, poverty and lack of housing in London. Men, women and children crowded into doorstops, sleeping with little comfort or care, had a profound effect on him. The area is described again through the triplets in reek with crime, with filth, with misery, and this infers that the area is riddled with problems, is not safe, and has less salvurious characters in the area. Therefore, showing Scrooge, this tells us that life was not worth anything. The laundress, his cleaner, and even the undertaker's man have stolen from Scrooge's dead body, probably before it was even cold, which shows how little respect he has garnered in his lifetime. Scrooge is still aware, however, that this is about him. It is only later, with the dramatic revealing of the gravestone, that Scrooge realises that everything he has been shown relating to death has been about him. The ghost points with his outstretched hands an eerie and unsettling experience to Scrooge towards the grave, which reveals a neglected grave, his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge, showing no one ever visits the grave, and everything that Scrooge worked for in life was pointless and futile as in death. He is forgotten, and his wealth meant nothing. This is when the realisation occurs to Scrooge, and he inquires of the mute ghost, "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" telling the reader that he has understood the messages of death that have been shown to him. Scrooge wants to know whether these events will come true, and seems moved almost to tears at the sight of Bob's grief at the death of Tiny Tim earlier in the stave, but he receives no answer. In the end, Scrooge promises to live in the past, the present and the future, implying that he has taken on board the messages that the ghosts have provided him with, and that he understands the folly of his former ways and that he is willing to change. Perhaps the way the ghost in the future has so boldly presented death in juxtaposing ways with Tiny Tim mourned and loved and Scrooge forgotten and unloved, creates an epiphany in Scrooge and makes him realise that he, in fact, needs to change. Dickens's overall message then, throughout the stave, shows that death is solemn, final and almost inevitable for Scrooge. The way death is presented by Dickens shows that we have to consider the way we treat others in life, and we need to be kind, charitable and good to others around us, or the fate that Scrooge is shown in Stave 4 could very well be the fate that we deserve. Death is shown to be a fearful prospect, and being left with no legacy and nobody to mourn for you would be tantamount to hell. Dickens's clear message is about being good, humane and showing the milk of human kindness towards other people. Okay, so on the next few slides, and obviously this has been turned into a video, I've written an essay about death in Stave 4 using the information from the revision video. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video, have a read, make some notes, make sure you understand it, and then continue to do the same for the next couple of sections. Okay, so again, pause the video now, read the essay, make some notes, check that you understand the information. Again, pause the video now. And finally, pause the video now. Thank you, Year 11.